There is a particular kind of silence that grows inside a person who has decided, quietly and without announcement, to stop showing up. Not the silence of peace, not the stillness that comes after a storm has passed and the air feels clean and open, but a different kind of silence, one that has walls in it, one that you built yourself over months or years, brick by careful brick, and which now surrounds you so completely that you have stopped noticing you are inside it. You know this silence. You might be living inside it right now. You stopped returning the calls, you made the excuses, you watched the invitations slow and eventually stop, and you felt something that confused you because it was not quite relief and not quite grief, but some uneasy mixture of both. A feeling that you had wanted exactly this and that getting it had somehow made things worse. Maybe you told yourself it was temporary. You needed time. You were tired, overwhelmed, going through something you could not explain. You would come back when you felt more like yourself. But the time passed, and you did not come back. And slowly you began to wonder whether the self you were waiting to return to had ever existed in the way you remembered, or whether you had been performing something for so long that you no longer knew what you were performing, or for whom, or why. And so you withdrew further, not dramatically, not with a declaration, but in the small cumulative ways that isolation builds itself, cancelled plans, shorter responses, a growing preference for the predictability of your own company over the unpredictable demands of other people. What I want to explore with you today is not how to fix this. I am not going to offer you a list of strategies for reconnecting, or a framework for overcoming social anxiety, or a set of affirmations about your worth and lovability. Those things exist in abundance, and they have not reached whatever is actually happening in you, which is why you are here. What I want to offer instead is a different kind of understanding, the kind that does not point toward a solution, but toward a truth, the kind that, when you encounter it, makes you feel less like a problem to be solved and more like a human being in the middle of a genuine and complicated experience. The philosopher Hannah Arendt spent much of her intellectual life examining what it means to exist among others, what she called the public realm, the space where human beings appear to one another, where they act and speak and become real through the witness of other people. She was deeply interested in what happens when that space collapses, when people retreat from it, when the conditions that make genuine human appearance possible are withdrawn or destroyed. She was writing primarily about political life, about totalitarianism and its effects on the human capacity for community. But what she identified in those extreme conditions illuminates something we can recognize in quieter, more ordinary forms of the same withdrawal, in the private retreats we make from the lives we thought we were building, in the disappearing acts we perform in plain sight. Arendt understood that the impulse to withdraw is not simply a personality quirk or a symptom of dysfunction. It is, in many cases, a response to something real, something that has gone wrong not inside a person, but in the relationship between a person and the world they inhabit. To understand withdrawal, you have to understand what it is a response to. And that requires looking honestly at what it actually costs a human being to be present in the world, to be genuinely visible to other people, not just physically present, but emotionally and psychologically available, open to being seen and judged and misunderstood and known imperfectly and loved inadequately. Because that cost is real, it is not imaginary. The pain that drives people into solitude is not weakness. It is the accumulated evidence of what happens when presence becomes too expensive. Consider what it actually means to be among people. You carry yourself into every room with a kind of implicit offering. Here I am. This is how I speak, how I think, what I care about, what makes me laugh. And in response to that offering, other people respond with their own interpretations of you, their expectations, their needs, their projections, their disappointments. Over time, you accumulate a self that is partly your own and partly constructed from what others have reflected back at you. The version of you that your parents needed you to be, the version your friends found useful, the version your colleagues could relate to, the version your romantic partners fell in love with, which was never quite the whole of you but always some carefully edited selection. And at some point, if you are paying attention, you begin to feel the weight of all those partial selves. You begin to sense the distance between who you actually are in the quiet interior of your own experience and who you have been performing for the world. This is where withdrawal often begins. Not with trauma, though trauma is certainly part of the story for many people, but with a kind of exhaustion that is harder to name. The exhaustion of constant translation. The exhaustion of making yourself legible to people who want you to be simpler than you are. The exhaustion of investing in connections that somehow never quite become what you needed them to be, that hover always at the level of pleasantness and function without ever descending into the kind of depth that would make them feel worth the effort. I know many of you watching this have been carrying something like this for a long time. Something you have never quite put into words, a tiredness that runs beneath the surface of your ordinary days, a sense of being slightly beside yourself in social situations, watching yourself perform the rituals of connection while something inside you remains unmoved and distant. You have wondered if something is wrong with you. You have wondered why it seems so much easier for other people, why they can move through their social lives with an ease and pleasure that seems genuinely foreign to your experience. Maybe you have tried to fix it, pushed yourself to go to the gatherings, made the effort to reach out, practiced the social scripts and wondered why they felt like scripts and not like genuine exchange. And the effort left you more depleted than before, which seemed to confirm that you were not built for this the way other people are. But here is what I want you to consider. What if what you are experiencing is not a deficit, but a form of perception? What if the distance you feel in social situations is not the absence of connection, but the presence of clarity, a clarity about the conditions under which genuine connection is actually possible? This is not a comfortable question. It does not resolve easily into reassurance, but I think it is the more honest question, and I think it points towards something important about what it means to be a person who withdraws, and what that withdrawal is actually trying to accomplish. I want you to pause here for a moment, because what I'm about to say is not something people often say to those who withdraw, and it is not something the conventional wisdom about isolation and loneliness will prepare you for. Your withdrawal is not irrational. It is a response to something real. It is in its own way a form of intelligence, a recognition that certain conditions for genuine human contact have not been met, that the connections available to you have been asking you to show up as less than you are. The question is not how to overcome the withdrawal, but how to understand what it has been protecting, and whether what it has been protecting is something that can now be brought into a different kind of light. If this perspective is opening something up for you, consider subscribing. I explore these territories every week, and I would be honored to have you along for this ongoing conversation. Arendt wrote about something she called the space of appearance, the realm where human beings become real to one another through genuine action and speech. This is not a physical space, but a relational one. It exists wherever people come together in a way that allows their genuine individuality to become visible. And she was clear that this space can be destroyed. It can be destroyed by tyranny, by conformity, by the reduction of human beings to their functions, by social environments that demand a kind of performance rather than a presence. When the space of appearance collapses, people lose more than connection. They lose, in some fundamental sense, the conditions under which they become real to themselves. Because we do not simply exist in the privacy of our own minds. We exist, as Arendt understood it, in the between, in the space that opens up when genuine human beings genuinely encounter one another. What this means for the person who withdraws is something subtle and worth sitting with. The withdrawal is often experienced as a retreat into a more authentic self, away from the falseness and superficiality of social life, back into the privacy of genuine interiority. And there is something real in that experience. Privacy is essential. The inner life requires protection. Arendt herself was deeply aware of the importance of the private realm, the space where we are not on display, where we can think and feel without the pressure of public judgment. But she also understood that the private realm, taken alone, is not sufficient. A self that exists only in private, that never appears, never acts, never speaks genuinely in the space between itself and others, is a self that begins to lose its own reality. The very interiority that feels like home begins to feel like a cell. This is the paradox of long-term withdrawal, and it is worth naming directly because most conversations about isolation focus on the social cost, the loneliness, the missed connections, the health effects, without examining the internal cost, the way prolonged withdrawal begins to corrode the very self it was meant to protect. You go inside to find yourself, and for a time the inner space feels rich and real and sufficient. But without the friction of genuine encounter with others, without the resistance that comes from being seen and misunderstood, and challenged and known imperfectly, the self begins to become something airless. The thoughts circle, the same interpretations repeat. The stories you tell about why the world is the way it is, and why people are the way they are, and why connection is impossible or not worth the cost, those stories harden into certainties because no one is there to contest them. Arendt had a phrase for a related phenomenon in political life, the banality of evil, by which she meant not monstrous wickedness, but the ordinary human capacity for harm that comes from simply not thinking, from carrying out patterns of behavior without ever stepping back to examine them. I want to borrow that idea in a gentler form and suggest that there is a kind of banality of withdrawal, a way in which the retreat from the world becomes its own unexamined routine, its own set of patterns that feel safe and familiar, but that are never quite put under genuine scrutiny. The person who withdraws often has very clear and intelligently articulated reasons for doing so. They have been hurt, the world has been disappointing, people have let them down. Connection requires too much performance, too much compromise, too much exposure. These reasons are real, they are not fabrications. But they can also become a kind of thinking that has stopped thinking, a conclusion that is revisited constantly, but never genuinely reconsidered. A story that has become too comfortable to examine from the outside. I know many of you have never spoken to anyone about how deep this has gone. You have kept the shape of it to yourself, the way the days have started to look, the way even the thought of reaching out to someone feels like a task you do not have the resources for, the way solitude has become not a choice, but a default, a gravitational field that requires more energy to escape than to remain inside. And there is something in you that is not sure whether you want to escape it. Part of you has made a kind of peace with the walls, has stopped expecting them to come down, has begun to organize your life around the assumption that this is simply who you are now. How long have you been carrying this alone? That is what I want to ask you. Not as a provocation, but as a genuine question, because naming it, even in a comment, even just to a screen, creates a different relationship to it than the relationship of pure private containment. If you want to share where you are in this, I am reading every comment. And if the words are hard to find right now, if articulating it feels too complicated, you can simply type, "I have been here too." Those 4 words are enough, because someone else watching this needs to see them. Someone else needs to know that what they are experiencing is not unique to them, not a private failure, not evidence of some fundamental unfitness for human life. Your willingness to be seen even this much creates permission for others to take the same small step. And that matters more than you know. Let me come back now to the question of what withdrawal is actually protecting, because I think this is where the most important understanding lives. When we retreat from others, we are almost always retreating from something specific, from a particular quality of interaction that we have found consistently disappointing or painful or depleting. And if we examine that quality carefully enough, we usually find not a flaw in ourselves or in other people, but a structural problem in the kind of connection that has been available. This is a distinction that matters enormously and that gets lost in the standard narrative about withdrawal, which tends to frame the problem as either a personal disorder or a circumstantial bad luck. Either you are too anxious or too sensitive or too something, or you simply have not met the right people yet. What I am suggesting is something different. I am suggesting that many people who withdraw are people who have a particular kind of hunger for depth, for the kind of contact that involves genuine risk and genuine exposure, that goes beneath the surface of pleasantness into something that actually matters. And they have found through repeated experience that this kind of contact is remarkably rare. Not because people are shallow, most people are not shallow. Most people are carrying a private depth that they are simply not showing, because the social environments in which they operate do not create conditions for that depth to appear. The dinner party, the work meeting, the casual gathering, these are structures that evolve to manage contact, to make it predictable and safe, to smooth over the rough edges that appear when genuine human beings genuinely encounter one another. They are not designed to produce depth, they are designed to produce pleasantness. And pleasantness for someone with a genuine hunger for depth is not neutral, it is actively painful. It is the experience of being at a table covered with food that you cannot eat. This is why telling someone who withdraws to simply be more social, to push through the discomfort, to say yes more often, to put themselves out there, is not merely unhelpful, but often counterproductive. It is advice that treats the symptom as the disease. The discomfort in social situations for the person who withdraws is not anxiety in the simple sense. It is a response to a genuine mismatch between what those situations offer and what that person actually needs. Increasing exposure to situations that reliably produce this mismatch does not resolve the underlying need. It simply exhausts the person while confirming their suspicion that genuine connection is not something the world readily provides. Arendt understood that action, genuine political action, required what she called courage, not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage of appearance, the willingness to step into the public space and be seen, to speak and act, knowing that the consequences are unpredictable, that you cannot control how you will be received, that you might be misunderstood or dismissed or forgotten. This courage, she argued, is what makes the public realm possible. Without it, the space of genuine human encounter collapses. People speak only what is safe to speak, do only what is expected of them, perform the rituals of public life without bringing anything genuinely themselves into it. And the result is a kind of shared performance, a public life that is technically populated but existentially empty. I think something analogous happens in the private sphere, in the daily relational life of individuals. There is a kind of interpersonal courage that genuine connection requires, the courage to be present as you actually are, rather than as you think you should be, to speak honestly, rather than strategically, to show the parts of yourself that are uncertain or unfinished or difficult, to invite response rather than manage impression. This courage is genuinely hard. It requires, among other things, a tolerance for the discomfort of not knowing how you will be received, a willingness to be known imperfectly, to accept that the version of you that appears to others will always be a translation, never quite the original. And for people who have been hurt by that process, who have shown themselves honestly and found that what they revealed was unwelcome or misused or simply not seen, the development of this courage requires something more than willpower. It requires a gradual rebuilding of the conviction that appearance is worth it, that the risk of being seen is less costly than the certainty of being invisible. This is not something that can be rushed. It is not something that responds to exhortation. But it is also not impossible. Arendt believed in what she called natality, the capacity that belongs to every human being to begin something genuinely new, to introduce into the world something that was not there before. This capacity does not expire. It is not diminished by difficulty or by years of accumulated disappointment. The withdrawal that has settled around you is not your permanent condition. It is a response to conditions that have not yet been right, that have not yet provided what genuine presence requires. But conditions change. People find their way to different kinds of spaces, to conversations that do not ask them to perform, to relationships that can hold more than pleasantness, to encounters that produce the kind of recognition that makes the risk of appearance feel worth it. The person who withdraws is not at their core someone who does not want connection. They are someone whose standards for connection are high and whose experiences of failed connection have been costly enough to make them extremely cautious about the investment. There is nothing pathological in this. There is, in fact, something that looks like wisdom, a recognition of the real cost of genuine presence, a refusal to pretend that superficial contact is sufficient. The problem is not the standard. The problem is the conclusion that the standard can never be met, that the world will always and reliably fail to provide what is needed, that withdrawal is therefore the only rational response. This conclusion is understandable. It is also, in the deepest sense, untested, because the person who withdraws stops exposing themselves to the very experiences that might contradict it. The story of impossibility becomes self-confirming, not because the world is actually incapable of providing depth, but because the withdrawal removes the person from the field where depth occasionally and unpredictably appears. And here we encounter one of the most important truths about long-term isolation. It creates its own evidence. The longer you are away from genuine contact, the more your understanding of what contact is like is shaped by memory and anticipation rather than actual present experience. The hurt that drove you in was real. But the world you have been avoiding is not the world that hurt you. Time has passed, people have changed. You have changed. The encounter you fear is partly a ghost, an anticipation built from genuine past wounds, but applied forward to a present that has not yet been tested. If what I am sharing here resonates with something real in your experience, something you have been sitting with alone for a long time, I want you to know that you are not alone in this. There are many people walking this same edge, people who want connection and who are afraid of it, who have gone quiet for reasons that made sense at the time and who are not sure how to find their way back, or whether they want to, or what back even means at this point. I create these conversations for people who are not satisfied with easy answers, who want to think seriously about what is actually happening inside them, who are willing to sit with difficult truths because the comfortable ones have not been helping. If that sounds like you, I would be honored to have you subscribe. Not as a transaction, not as a way to pad some number, but because this kind of inquiry is better done in community, because other people asking the same questions in the comments often illuminate things I had not considered, because the conversation that happens here matters. And if this particular video has given you something to think with, tell me in the comments what it stirred up for you. I read every single one, and I mean that genuinely. Let me turn now to something that I think gets very little attention in the conversation about withdrawal. And that is what it means to live with the self that withdrawal produces over time. Because the person who has been alone for a long time is not simply a social person in hibernation. They have been shaped by the solitude. Their inner life has taken on a particular texture, a density and self-referentiality that is both its richness and its limitation. The thoughts are intricate. The self-awareness is often acute. There is a kind of developed interiority that comes from long periods of reflection without external friction, a landscape of inner experience that is complex and sometimes beautiful and that feels, in honest moments, insufficient. Because here is what solitude cannot do, no matter how rich or developed it becomes. It cannot provide the specific kind of knowledge that comes only from being genuinely encountered by another person. When someone who truly sees you reflects back to you what they see, something happens that no amount of private self-reflection can produce. You discover aspects of yourself that only appear in relation, qualities and contradictions and capacities that have no occasion to manifest in solitude, that require the presence of another person to call them into being. The self that exists only in private is, in a real sense, an incomplete self, not deficient, not lesser, but incomplete in the way that a photograph is incomplete, capturing something real, but missing the dimension of time, of response, of the unpredictable way that genuine encounter changes both parties. Arendt wrote about this in terms of what she called the who of a person, the unique identity that reveals itself through action and speech, that cannot be summarized or fixed in advance, that surprises even the person it belongs to in the moment of its expression. The who, she argued, is not something you possess in advance and then bring into the world. It is something that emerges in the act of appearing, in the moment of genuine encounter, in the space between yourself and another. This means that the self you are waiting to become, the fuller version of yourself that you imagine will one day be ready to appear, is not waiting for you in the privacy of your interiority. It is waiting in the encounter you have been avoiding. It will emerge in relation or it will not emerge at all. This is not a call to action. I am not telling you to go out tomorrow and be vulnerable with strangers. That would miss the point entirely. What I am pointing toward is something subtler, a shift in the understanding of what the self actually is and where it lives and what it requires. If the self is not a fixed interior object but a living process that unfolds in relation, then the project of finding yourself in solitude has a fundamental limit. You can understand more about yourself in solitude. You can clarify your values and your needs and your patterns. You can rest and recover and gather yourself. But you cannot complete yourself there. The completion, if that word can be used for something that is never actually finished, happens in the encounter. And perhaps the most important thing that withdrawal has been protecting is not the self from harm, but the self from the particular kind of change that only encounter can produce. Because genuine contact changes you. It does not leave you the same. It introduces into your experience something you did not expect, something that could not have been predicted from inside the self you were before the encounter. And for someone who has organized their inner life very carefully, who has developed a complex and self-sufficient interior world, the prospect of genuine change, of being altered by another person, of having your understanding of yourself disrupted, is genuinely threatening. It is not just the pain of past connection that drives the withdrawal. It is also the self-preserving instinct of a self that has worked hard to become coherent, that does not want to be unmade. But here is what I want to offer as a closing thought. Not a solution, not a resolution, but a reframing that I hope you will carry with you. What if the self that genuine encounter might unmake is not the self you are trying to protect, but the self that has been limiting you? What if the coherence you have built in solitude is a kind of provisional identity, real and meaningful and worth respecting, but ultimately a preparation for something rather than the thing itself? What if the withdrawal, for all its costs, has been doing exactly what it needed to do, giving you the interior ground from which to eventually risk a different kind of appearance, one that is not a performance but a genuine showing, one that does not ask you to edit yourself into something more manageable, but allows you to arrive, complicated and uncertain and real, into the space of genuine encounter? You came in today perhaps recognizing yourself in the description of someone who has gone quiet, who has let the distances grow, who has found themselves on the far side of a withdrawal they did not entirely intend. And I hope what you are leaving with is not a plan to fix that, because the fixing approach has never quite reached whatever this actually is. I hope you are leaving with something more useful, which is the understanding that your withdrawal makes sense, that it is a response to something real, that it has been protecting something genuine, and that it does not have to be permanent. Not because you should push yourself back into the world before you are ready, but because the readiness you have been waiting for is not something that arrives fully formed in solitude. It arrives in the small acts of genuine appearance, in the moment when you speak something true in the presence of another person and find that the world does not end, that something actually shifts, that the space between yourself and that other person becomes, if only briefly, the kind of space where something real can happen. That space has always been possible. It has always been there, waiting not for you to become someone different, not for you to heal completely or understand yourself fully or guarantee that you will not be hurt again, but for you to be willing to bring whoever you actually are, wounded and weary and genuinely alive, into the presence of another person and see what emerges. That is the risk. That is also the invitation. And it is the same invitation that has always been at the heart of what it means to be human, not the guarantee of safety, but the possibility of genuine encounter. The chance to be, even briefly and imperfectly, fully real in the presence of another person who is attempting the same terrifying and necessary thing.